I'd just like to welcome everybody and declare this meeting open. Welcome everybody to the meeting of the Skills Economy and Growth Scrutiny Commission, to all of our guests joining us virtually, and to everybody watching online. Just a reminder of a few bits of housekeeping when related to hybrid meetings like this. This meeting is being recorded and live streamed. If anyone is virtual, please can you keep your microphone on mute throughout the meeting, as that avoids audio feedback. If you're still getting feedback, please turn off any nearby devices. If you'd like to speak, can you raise your hand to get my attention? If you're in the room, you can do it like that. There you go. If you're on the screen, please use the hand raise button. I have got a screen in front of me. I can see them. If, however, for any reason I do miss you, then give me a wave, but the virtual one should work. Also, remember to tell us who you are and where you're from, or sorry, your affiliation. There is a chat function, but it's not to be used for conversations with other participants or to provide personal information. All the chat's recorded. Only use the function to alert me that you wish to speak, to raise points of order, or to report tech problems. This is a formal meeting of Hackney Council. Please note the press may be in attendance. The right of the press and public to record and film the meeting will apply. So we first have introduction and apologies for absence. We have got a couple of apologies already for this meeting. Councillor Smith and Councillor Premaru. Councillor Talbot-Deloff and Councillor Walker are here. They're just absent themselves at the moment. Councillor Walker will be in and out of this meeting because of obligations regarding the licensing committee that's also being held at the same time. Do we have any other apologies for absence from either commission members or from officers? No? Okay. Councillors in virtual attendance, we have Councillor Anna Lynch. That's it. Thank you, Anna, for joining us. I'm going to remind everybody, as I always do, in case anybody is watching and wondering, unfortunately, the national law prevents Councillor Lynch's attendance from being counted towards quoracy or for her attendance at the meeting, even though she is protecting herself and her health in the long-term risks around the pandemic. Right, urgent items or order of business. We don't think we have any urgent items, so we should be able to carry on. Just a reminder about things that will happen in what order. We've got the economic development discussion, which will start shortly. That will last 50 minutes. Then we have cabinet question time with Councillor Coburn, which should start at 10 to 8. And we are working through that until 9 o'clock. Then we will have a short discussion about minutes and the work programme. Obviously, anybody who is attending the meeting for a specific part of the meeting, you are very welcome to stay, but we won't be offended if you want to go. It's sometimes these things are of interest to other people. Sometimes they would like to be able to get on and do other things. So, do we have any declarations of interest from the Commission? No, Chair. Tracy, are we comfortable to continue with this without Councillor Walker?
Yes, of course.
Right, okay. So, right, to the meat of the meeting, we have economic development update on metrics. We've got 45 minutes for this meeting starting now. Thank you very much, Michael, for attending as the Economic Development Manager. We're very pleased to see the presentation that you've shared with us. Everybody's had a good look at it already, which is great. This item is an update on the development of metrics linked to the work on the economic development by the Council. The Commission wants to ensure that the objectives of the Council's economic development plan are being achieved, and to review how the Council proposes to measure the impact of the activities undertaken to shape an inclusive economy. This discussion is to review the work to date on developing new metrics which allow the Council to measure the impact of its work. As ever, a very wise mayor said, if you can't measure it, you can't act on it. So we need to make sure that we know what we're doing. So we're going to look at an introduction to economic development metrics, the Council's approach to developing them, and some examples of that key activity stream with some example metrics. Michael, I'm going to hand over to you. You've got about 10 minutes to have a chat before to kind of talk through what you've got, and then we'll ask questions, if that's all right.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so you've all read the presentation, and I just want to emphasise that I'm going through our approach here, not the actual specifics of actual measures.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of the slides, we can skip slide 1. Slide 2 is the traditional reminder that I've always put up on the levers. Slide 3 is just to emphasise that economic development is different to economic growth. You've seen that before, just there for reference, we don't need to talk about it again. And then I'll just pause on slide 4 there. So you all probably know this, but I want to be absolutely clear. So you've got to understand what you're measuring. And that sounds really easy, but actually it's not. So are you measuring the inputs? So that's the things that go in. So that might be financial resource or time or even policies that are developed. The process is the kind of activity, so that's tracking, if you're going to do something, are you following that process in a set period of time, following certain standards, etc. Outputs, they're the things that kind of pop out of the process. So that might be a document, or it might be an individual shifting into employment. It's quite specific kind of thing, countable nouns, things you can count. Outcomes is the aggregation of outputs, so the kind of change, the results of all of the activity. And then I think kind of more recent thinking in the last decade is to think through like sequencing of outcomes. So we often talk about, our aim is to have an inclusive economy, and that's a very long-term outcome. It's actually, I think, probably ill-advised to try to jump straight to it, because there's a lot that needs to happen in between, and that's where this term intermediary outcomes kind of comes through. And it's useful to think short, medium, long term, see them build over time. And even outcomes can be different. There are changes in what you might achieve, but there are also changes to policy. So influencing the GLA, for example, for some kind of enabling measure, could be a valid kind of outcome. So it's important to think about that as different kind of forms of measurement. And I just want to give you a flavour, of how some of these kind of dynamics change. And you've probably seen some of this from, I imagine, Sonia Khan's presentation is probably around 2018, 2019. So on slide 5, some quite interesting work done by the Institute of Global Prosperity, saying that we shouldn't rely on the traditional economic metrics of gross domestic product, etc. We should be thinking of these other elements of prosperity. It's a bit difficult to see on the screen, but you've got the pack. So you have, these different kind of themes, which is valid and it's good. It makes it difficult because you've got so much more to consider and look at and try to track change. And then on slide, I'm not going to pause there because I've only got 10 minutes. We're doing questions after. So on slide 7, you see these terms. You may have come across them. So theory of change and logic models, quite often used interchangeably, but it's really a different way of thinking about your planning and therefore your measurement. And in my previous role, I used to do quite a lot of impact evaluation as part of the work that the consultancy did. And so we did this quite a lot. So this is normally the domain actually of health providers and health services and charities and charitable foundations. They've been using this for years. And it started to filter through to other elements of the public sector. So I'm not going to repeat kind of the slide, but essentially it's about thinking through the sequence of where you are now to where you want to be, and tracking, the things that need to change on the way. And the important thing for our topic of discussion today is then how you measure those things. So not your traditional, I can be slightly critical of this with my colleagues, of put everything in a great big spreadsheet and then set up a board and monitor it. Like, it's a little bit reductive, and in my career I've seen so much of that, and it's much better to be more nuanced, but does create additional risks because it takes a bit more time to do it. So anyway, what does all of this mean? Let's get on to a couple of examples, maybe to help inform your kind of questions. So slide 8 is an example there. I've just lifted these from other places. I can't claim credit, so I've referenced Nesta here, and this would have been the project that they looked at. So there's an example of a theory of change. So the flow and the different kind of activities. You'll see there's a series of blocks there called assumptions. I think that's really important. We have one huge assumption in play amongst the manifesto commitments and in my work, and it's around social businesses and cooperatives. So our assumption is that they offer good work, they're strong democratic organisations, that they use local suppliers, and that's a valid assumption, but it is an assumption. You know, it's not necessarily.
It's not been tested. It's not been tested.
No, it's not been tested, and it's fine to have assumptions, but it's good to give them visibility. And so you'll see that they've got some assumptions in that example there, and then it flows through, and they're using the terminology of ultimate goals. And then just over the page for another one, so it's about promoting walking into private neighbourhoods. This one's kind of flowing left to right. And you can see the information, so the situation and the need, and then you can see those kind of resources and inputs listed that then flow into activities in your outputs. And as I described earlier, you get the sequencing of outcomes. It's just a really kind of useful way of thinking it. And they've got their assumptions as a block in that bottom left corner. Over the page on 10 is just a template. I quite like this one. I've sent a few sessions about what works Centre for Local Economic Growth. I gravitate towards them because they're one of the only organisations I've come across that talk about training on theory of change logic modules for the economic context. So I find them particularly useful. So if you're into attending kind of quick lunchtime 1-hour sessions, they do free to access online things. They do some good stuff. I've tried to get them interested in doing consultancy work for us, but they don't do that, unfortunately. Okay, so very quickly, they're making it a bit more kind of real here, on to 12, kind of affordable workspace one. We have touched on this before, and as a quick reminder, you know, generally we count the quantum of affordable workspace that we leverage through the Section 106 planning system. So we count square meters. And the challenge is that good enough within the inclusive economy way of thinking? Because we haven't traditionally understood who the beneficiaries are, so kind of whose bums are on those seats in that affordable workspace. And so this is kind of capturing some of that, and affordable workspace will always be a challenge. The planners love to do their kind of technical studies on supply and demand of floor space of all different kinds, commercial floor space. But you know, I will tell you one thing: in the London economy, we could max out our provision of space
And never meet.
and so we could reduce the supply. It will still never meet demand.
Yeah.
And even if it doesn't meet demand in Hackney, we will suck demand towards us from all the other places in London. So in a way, we can target affordable workspace in any way we choose, because we will never ever meet demand. So, you know, that could be for maker spaces, so dirtier spaces for kind of crafts. It could be for, you know, the kind of traditional kind of tech, which is more kind of an office style. It could even be for some interesting points and challenges that are coming through around kind of community kitchens. So industrial scale kitchens for people who do some stuff at home, are quite successful in that, but need the next step. But yeah, we need to take, I think, some tough decisions on what we do about that in the future. But most of the changes achieved for the planning system, as you all know, we can only review planning policies at certain points in the cycle. We are a little bit constrained on some of those aspects. So I've covered most of the bullet points here. So let's go on to 13. So this is a example of a high-level logic model for some work that was funded a few years ago, London Regeneration Fund. This was actually in the evaluation of that program, which was done by a consultancy called CAS. So I've just kind of lifted it. Now, my observation is that actually this was done at the end. The evaluation was done at the end. This wasn't planned in advance, so that's, you know, a negative for a start because it wasn't planned in advance. Not CAG's fault. It's obviously GLA who funded it. It only covers the overall delivery of affordable workspace, and in my opinion, it's not kind of intentional enough. So on to next slide, slide 14. So this is not something we're necessarily going to do, just a clarification, but if we were to make that a more intentional version, this is what it would look like as a flow of the context, the inputs, the activities, and you can start to see, you know, the things that we might measure. So over the page to 15, and if we don't need to, you know, we don't need to measure every input, every process, every output, etc. But here are just some examples of if we were measuring under those banners, the kind of things that we would put in there as the measurement framework. So again, purely examples. And then just to conclude on this one, 16, you know, this work is not new. So all of these activities have been happening for years, and they will continue to happen. And if my team, you know, evaporated, it would all continue. But what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to work more closely with the corporate policy team because there's another stream of activity around embedding the strategic plan where this kind of period change approach is being deployed. And it's good to get wider, Stephen uses the term socialisation of the approach across the council. So when I have a conversation with someone in another service about this, they kind of know what I'm talking about, and we can walk away from the conversation knowing we've understood each other. And that leads to some of the kind of transformation work that's going on as well.
Sorry, that was my bad.
Oh, no, that's I know.
Not that brutal, Michael.
I know.
We are close to time. Yeah. Yes, go on.
So two more kind of bullet points, and then you know we haven't necessarily done this in the bit of the local authority that I'm in. So you know we want to trial this outcomes framework approach in economy regeneration, new homes. So Stephen Hayes' domain under Ricardo. We want to bring in some consultants to help us do it. And we've got two kind of outcomes that we want to trial the kind of in-depth work. So one is on improving employment skills opportunities, you know, so broad, long-term outcomes. And then the other one is around increasing local and social spend. So lots of people are overly fixated on procurement. They shine their lens on procurement. And actually, it needs to be the commissioning service, procurement, economic development team can help. We need to work together as a, I don't know if triumvirate is the right word, but how do we do that? How do we develop the logic one? How do we collaborate? So we're going to be doing that. And then within Area Regen ourselves, we try and kind of improve our own practice. So we quite often do summative evaluations, which is evaluation at the end, and trying to get the team to think about it at the start. So you can plug in the gathering of the measurements as you go through. You can do a better job with the evaluation. But you can learn as you go. You can adapt the program, so you get that beneficial kind of loop, learning loops, as we say. There you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I mean, very helpful presentation and great way of talking it through. It does always help when we've been able to have early sight of the slide and chance to explore them ourselves. We've got some things to ask you. I don't know where we'd like to start. Does anybody want to pick up straight away on some of the potential lines of inquiry that we've got here? If not, I'm going to start. But I'm going to start at the end. I thought one of the things that was most striking was your point about how two things that was striking. One is that there can be a bit of an issue with doing this measurement after the fact, and it's sort of in the rearview mirror. At the same time, as you said, that a lot of this stuff takes a long time to have impacts, and that this stuff has been happening whether you were there or not doing the measurement. And I'm particularly struck by how those two things interrelate, because we've been doing a lot of work on inclusive growth and economic development, and regeneration, because we've had lots of money to do that for a long time, because we've got those as strategic priorities. If we haven't had this kind of embedded evaluation and metrics in that work, that doesn't mean we can't do some post hoc evaluation in order to be able to understand how things have changed as a result of our work in the past, because we need to make some learnings from those in order for us to make the decisions in the future. I'm sorry, that's a statement rather than a question. My question, I suppose, is what can we do about what we have done so that we understand it better in order to be able to inform not just our measurement, but also our future strategy?
So we absolutely can evaluate any program with a summative evaluation at the end, and it is very common. It's just better to plan it in advance, and that's where the best kind of practice is. So it depends what we want to look at. This starts to get into a bit of a tricky territory, and the key word, we've talked about it before, is attribution. So if we look at some of the measures that the Institute of Global Prosperity use, and you think about wages and
Slide 5, yeah.
Yeah, and underneath that there's a massive index that they use with a whole bunch of measures, and if you pull those out, and you do that measurement, it's really difficult to attribute, say, the regeneration activity and the social aspects linked to that people in the team cover. It's really difficult to link the change to the actual activity, because within economic realm, it's very different to health. in health, you can get much clearer attribution, for those of you aware of that gender. So what I always favour is that we should be measuring and evaluating our individual programs. So be clear about their targeted inputs and what we expect to get from it, and then measure those. And then there's a whole, if we've collected the data, which some challenges in Hackney because of the cyber attack, then we can assess it. So we can do it.
We can do it. I think
we can do it. And I think what I would say is, how much time and effort can we allocate to it versus the value of what we get from understanding it? And that's not saying we shouldn't do it. It's just that balance of, should we tip our relatively limited resources into sorting out the future and the future measurement and the new world, or some of it that is backward looking? We can do a bit of both. I have to say it's mostly my team that does this. If we do the backward looking piece, we'll have to stop doing the forward looking piece, because I only have a couple of people. So that's where it gets tricky, and that's not my normal clear answer, but that is my answer.
Yeah, no, I think I understand where you're coming from. Claudia, you wanted to ask a question about Councillor Walker. Have you got other ones that you'd like to ask as well?
Yes, there are a couple of them that came up for me. Thank you very much, Michael. That was very informative. It's interesting.
And then Councillor Potter and then Councillor Lynch. Go on.
Sure. It's interesting as well to hear what you mentioned about theory of change and the assumptions of those.
You want to put your microphone on?
Yeah, I would love to put my microphone. Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. It was very informative. I have a couple of questions. One of them related to theory of change and those assumptions that they're based on. I'm just thinking in terms of COVID. Have these assumptions been? Have they changed? Has the trend shifted on those assumptions post-pandemic to reflect the changes within the community? Is that anything that? Is there any data on that, or are you aware of that? And I guess a similar line for me is about affordable workspace, which I know the council has done great work on that. However, it's also important to know whether the trends also have changed according to the pandemic with the workspace. Because now you see, just as the last thing, we notice now in coffee shops, for example, you see almost like 5-6 businesses in one table sharing that space. So where is that? How is that reflecting with affordable workspace? So, yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Turn your mic. You need to turn your microphone so that is on.
So So just on assumptions, this is work in process, so we haven't started on the two examples that we talked about, but one will be on employment, one will be on local spend. So on employment, I think some of the assumptions would change kind of post-COVID. As you'll know from other kind of statistics, there are certain kind of segments of the workforce that are just opting out. It's not working anymore. From what I've seen, in the news reporting, it's like an old segment, kind of people just checking out early. So that might change the assumptions around getting over 50s into employment. You'll know historically that there's been a push on that sometimes. So, if we were to have a program targeting that age group, our assumption will be that the over 50s are as committed to employment as they were previously.
Right.
Yeah, because we've got some data that says something else. So if it's untested, put it in as the assumption. Then I think on affordable workspace, so your second question, when we engage with affordable workspace providers, they say that their waiting list for their spots is as long as ever. So the demand is still there. But I think increasingly you see individuals working in cafes. You don't know whether that they're not going into their main office and they're normally working at home and they go to their cafe for a bit of a break and a bit of socialization. Some of the workspace providers have seen they've had to work a bit to make sure that the demand stays up. So they've changed their offer a bit. They've made everything much more flexible because people in office type jobs where you can have anything, they will do some work from home, but there's just still demand for it. I think for me on the affordable workspace, we need to do more work on, it's a bit of a technical term, but the typologies of space. So we're like overly reliant on your office style.
Yeah.
And I don't, if I'm honest, let's be quite brutal, that's mostly kind of white, middle class, highly educated people who probably could pay for WeWork. And if we think about the community aspect of inclusive economy, it's much different. It's much more creative, and it's those kitchen bits. And we've got, without wanting to run away too much, there's an asset review process, and we know that on estates we've got some underutilized kind of community buildings, and there's a whole kind of interesting mix of, I think, opportunity and leveraging that. Now there would need to be money for fit out and all of that, but that's where I think we should be prioritizing our affordable workspace efforts in a different direction. I mean, planning will still leverage those offices because in Shoreditch, the towers will still get built, and a certain percentage will still be office style, but it can take care of itself. It doesn't need any effort from my team or Suzanne's team to cover it. But what I've just said there about community kitchens, that's an assumption. It's untested at the moment. We have a little bit of data, anecdotal. We've been approached by some people who run the apps that leverage that opportunity and create the opportunity for those individuals. We don't know how ethical that is. Are they taking advantage of the people who cook here? Is there space for some more social kind of dynamic? So we need to test that.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Can we have Councillor Potter and then Councillor Lynch?
I've got a couple of questions. Put the mic off. So my first point follows on from Councillor Billington's question on looking back. So I'm, obviously Hackney Fashion Walk has been in the news very, very recently, and thinking about all the big projects from several years ago, the Olympic Park, for instance. I presume we made commitments at the time. That would be part of you looking back, because you would still want to learn lessons from that, and also to to move on both of those, not just those projects, but others like it. And my other question is, trying to understand the benefits of which approach is better, the logic model or the theory of change. The theory of change seems to be more all encompassing, there's lots feeding in and it grows and develops, whereas the logic model seems to be linear. And I'm looking at your preferred template. You haven't said what it is, but it looks like a mixture of both. Am I right there?
You are.
And which one would you, I don't know, which would you see more of, or just kind of how is the council developing across the piece in terms of this whole approach, not just in economic development, I know that's what we want to focus on.
So I'll cover that one. I've noted the other two. So Sonia Khan,
You need your mic. Sorry.
So I'll cover the last one first, come back to the first two. So Sonia Khan, corporate policy team, are going to collaborate with me on bringing the consultants in. And Sonia's idea is to cover off like the top tier or the top 2 or 3 tiers of local authority managers. I don't actually know what that's called. Maybe Deirdre does, but it's but to do some orientation sessions on theory of change approach. I'm much more interested in getting from that very quickly into the nitty gritty of what does a logic model look like, because that's the route to delivery. And as I said before, one of the reasons why I came to work here is that I want to do delivery. I spent a long time in my career doing strategy, not interested in that anymore. But so there is a joined up approach, and it will roll out through the offices. Now, I do not know whether they're going to be member orientation sessions. I haven't been here long enough to know whether that's a standard thing, but we could do it. So, and then I think from that flows, we've got the rollout and the delivery of the strategic plan. It's all being linked to that. And we're talking much more about service plans on a page, what do dashboards look like. And you know, when you're creating, if you imagine you're creating kind of a smart kind of dashboard, you're linking the measures in that back to your theory of change in your logic model, so getting it right. So, you know, we will get there as a process. Whether we can get everybody on board on the journey, we'll see as we go. Now, on the specifics of the other questions, so the Olympic Park. So there's a piece of work, so it's a Boroughs Borough Partnership, which is the remaining Olympic boroughs, and this is obviously the LLDC will kind of hand back planning powers. It will start to wind down some of its activity, particularly development activity. And the boroughs will take the helm much more. So I'm part of the inclusive economy subgroup of that. And some external consultants have done a piece of work on the metrics and the measures. They were framed under this kind of convergence banner back in the day. So that work has been done, and those measures will be available in the next couple of months. And then that inclusive economy group will look at, well, how are we going to collaborate on that patch around the Olympic Park on inclusive economy outcomes. And the key thing that we're all saying is we need to focus on where we can achieve more as 4 boroughs together versus as individuals, so we avoid duplication. So that's going to be the challenge. And the Institute of Global Prosperity are one of the partners in those metrics. So there will be some elements of the Olympics, but you know, it's quite political, as we all know. We shall see. As for the fashion quarter, and what's happened there, I have not had visibility of what the original intent was back in the day, and it even predates Suzanne, actually, to be honest, in the time she's been here. So personally, I don't think there's going to be any assessment of that. But what I do know is, with the successful Levelling Up Fund bid for Hackney Central and what happens on the patch next, that the measurement approach will be embedded in it. So you may know that PRD Consultancy have done the work supporting the Hackney Central plan, and I've seen the kind of the outcomes and the measurements within that. And we've got delivery capability now, courtesy of that Levelling Up Fund money. So, you know, for what happens next, I think it'll be a much smarter approach.
Can I just follow up on that? Not so much a question as an observation, that maybe some of the challenges about some of the learnings from those 2 previous projects is that they had targets of growth in and of themselves as the target, as the measure of success, as distinct from economic development per your slide. And that may well have contributed to some of the longer term limitations in terms of success for us as a borough.
I think for me, and being based in Hackney but not part of it, you know, so in my previous role, it might have been one assumption too many about potential success of Fashion Hub. I'll say no more than that.
Okay, Councillor Lynch, sorry, I wanted to bring you in.
Great, thanks, Chair. So basically, I work in the NHS, and we've been doing this for years. I'm just a little bit concerned that we're having to get consultants in when my experience is that even the most sort of junior sort of project program manager should have an idea of what theory of change is, and also about creating logic models as well. So I'm just a little bit concerned that we've got staff that may not have these competencies, given that we're now embarking on this. I just wanted to also just reflect on the sort of proposed template that you've got, because I've been I'm chair of audit, and I'm just sort of, again, very much used to having dashboards. You know, I want to see SPC charts on what we're delivering when we're not delivering it. And actually, I do really welcome this. So I just want to say thank you for trying to steer it. Like, what obviously looks like a bit of a Titanic in terms of getting people signed up to the logic models. But it's just a little bit, even though it may not be a particular fashion that it's not being used in the council, it is quite a broad, like, most people should understand how to sort of do sort of just simple sort of, you know, processes of like what are your outcomes. That's like the basics of anything. So that's just a comment really rather than a question, but thank you. I hope that's okay, Chair.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Michael.
Many staff across the authority, you know, do know what theory of change approaches are, and even logic models. But I think, you know, even from my read and my experience, there are slightly different interpretations and takes on the language involved, and, you know, the weight we put on inputs and outputs. And so it's good to do the exercise as a refresher for those that already know it, but also to develop that kind of the hackneyed common language around it. So, and the reason we're using externals is because that helps with the consistency. So imagine if Sonia Khan's team were going to do it, that's all they'd be doing for a period of time, and they have a lot of other responsibilities. So you deploy consultants, they bring the consistency and can work with them. And you know, it's just one of the kind of mixed resource approaches that we use.
Thank you, Michael. Claudia, did you want to ask the question on behalf of Councillor Walker? Oh, did he? Right, okay. So what Councillor Walker was asking, because he was particularly interested, in fact, all of us are, on this Institute of Global Prosperity Index. We also noted, what Councillor Walker pointed out earliest, was that Prosperity Index comes from 2018, pre-pandemic, halfway through Brexit, etc. What do we learn from, and I know that, as you point out here, that the research was based on 5 East London communities, including one in Hackney Wick. What has come out of that work, both in terms of how has the Prosperity Index had to change as a result of changing circumstances since 2018, and what learnings have we had specifically from the pilot in Hackney?
I'm not massively aware of the details of the learning from the pilot in Hackney, because it was some time ago and it informed the creation of the index. I think there is one learning point that I've read about. It's that it's quite community researcher based and therefore quite resource intensive. So it's humans conducting surveys.
So it's qualitative rather than quantitative.
No, there's quant, but they're talking about the challenges and issues, but not in a qualitative way. So they'll have a survey, they'll ask a set question, they'll get a response. I think the important thing is it's kind of trusted agents rather than a market research company. So there's that, which I see as for some of it is a bit tricky to replicate. In terms of what it measures and whether it needs to change, I'm not so sure that it does, because things they were measuring and that came to the fore more were that people put more weight by their own health and well-being than necessarily the pound in their pocket. So they will trade some kind of economic comforts for health comforts. You know, it's an individual to individual, but that kind of came through. So I think the measure is sound. I think the baseline might be very different pre-COVID, post-COVID, and people's responses, because I think it's probably shifting more towards people thinking more about their health and well-being. And so what was the rest of the question?
No, that's fine, because it's basically what's come out of that in terms of this, how circumstances change. So basically, what you've learned from the circumstances changing is the measure itself, the index itself, is pretty robust. In that, like you say, the baseline has changed because people have understood better.
And they
identified health as being more important to them.
And they have refined it. And we're going to get the next refinement. I haven't seen it yet, but the work I mentioned with Growth Pro Partnership and the Inclusive Economy, they've put together a set of measures. They're in draft form at the moment that we can use in this kind of East London context. So we'll get like the next iteration. And there's a slightly different lens to the 5 blocks we've got there. But perhaps in a future session.
Okay, that might go to Claudia's question about how locality specific they are. Because we understood that if it was built by the Institute of Global Prosperity, this would be by any, but they've actually designed it specifically for East London, have they?
No, so they based.
Yeah, no, that's it.
So they based it on the experience of East London, so it's probably more relevant to East London. I mean, if I was in a West London neighbourhood, I might be sitting there questioning, it and its validity. But it's highly pertinent to us, as you can guess, but maybe not every area of Hackney. But I think that maybe let's look at it in the future. And maybe the committee, I know you've got your set work programme, but you might be interested in that kind of East London economic dynamic. Because I always say the economy doesn't work at the Hackney level.
No.
You either, it's the hyper-local thing, where you've got a few businesses located together and they're beneficial, and there might be a community aspect. And even in Shoreditch, you've got like the office towers and you've got hospitality around it, hyper-local. And after that, it goes to sub-regional. You get the corridors, and they all work in different ways for different sectors. And then you've got London, and then London's global, rather than national.
One question we have got on our lines of inquiry, which I'd like to ask before we've got, John, have you got a question? Yeah, go on, sorry.
Yeah, it was just a bit of a follow-up to what you just said there about kind of the sort of different levels and the economy working in different ways. In terms of sort of measurement, kind of particularly thinking about this sort of affordable workspace example, is the measurement generally done on a borough-wide basis, or is it kind of more localized in sort of different projects? So would you be measuring how successful this was in certain spaces, or would you be looking at kind of demand in different bits of the borough, or would it just be Hackney-wide?
So currently our measurement is collected through the planning system and the Section 106 agreements that are signed, which are obviously per property, because that's where the development is. And then after that, we can aggregate it in any way we see fit. So we could look at Shoreditch, for example, and that's where most of it is. And then when there's developments in other places, we could do that as well. What I would propose for the future, if we're being more intentional, and we're talking about different types of workspace, that we might start to try and measure either by the typologies or the geographies, if we're trying to do something specific in an area. And that would be all up for debate. But that's part of the approach of being more intentional, framing what you do, and then the measurements dropping off it.
Can I follow up on that? Because I think what's really interesting, I think the language you're using is it's more intentional. But what I understand that in order to be more intentional, you have to really be clear about your assumptions, and many of those assumptions actually come from a particular insight, like the one that you identified in relation to workspaces, is that we've been focusing on desk space. Maybe that's because it was something in order to be able to drive economic growth in and of itself. Now we've got an inclusive growth strategy, we're going to have to be more sophisticated in the way that we develop and support particular kinds of affordable workspace. What I think that will be really interesting, there's two questions. One is, when and how do we see those insights being articulated in things like the inclusive growth plan, in order to be able to say, right, so therefore our metrics are going to be this. And where therefore do you see the current gaps in the council's measures metrics when it comes to things like this?
So if we switch away from the office style affordable workspace, the planning system won't deliver much of it for us because most of our development is in Shoreditch. Most of it is offices. It's within an office building. You know, you're not going to put a community kitchen in there because probably the community to use it isn't even there. So we need to, you know, if we refer back to those levers, so we've got planning as a lever over there, but we've got use of our own kind of our own commercial properties. You know, I can't take those decisions, by the way, just to emphasise that point. So I've been talking to colleagues in property about, well, when are the next kind of review cycles? Because they operate on, and you'll know about the VCS leases, that kind of lease approach that we deploy there. So there's a review cycle of what we do with those properties linked to when those leases expire, which I think are 2027. So we can't do much with that style of property and that review now, but we shouldn't leave it to 2027 because colleagues in property and economic development need to kind of work together, and then we need to have a wider discussion. And to be frank, it will be quite political because many of the VCS organisations, you know, engage with you as politicians. And if you're, say, you've got your commercial property leases, because we shouldn't forget that colleagues in property have to bring in income. So sometimes they have to max out the commercial angle to help pay for essential services, and I absolutely get that. And you've got the VCS block, normally in, say, less desirable properties, so they're at the cheaper end of the market, but they're still on sub-market leases. And then there's not much. We've got the odd bit in the middle, which is kind of subsidised workspace. Some of it is for affordable kind of provision. So we need to consider the whole mix. And, you know, there's got to be give at both ends. If we're going to fill out the middle a bit more, it's got to come from both ends. So, you know, so that's an example. We can't really, we should start talking about that probably in the 24-25 financial year, follow a like solid process, good engagement process. The other element, so if we're thinking about some of the underutilised, say, maybe community spaces and community halls and on the estates, so there's an asset review process that's ongoing. I'm not involved in it. Suzanne's dealing with that, which is doing the scoping, and then we will see where that goes. But, you know, we can only do that if we can invest. You know, a community kitchen just doesn't appear out of thin air. We will need to seek the capital fund to make the changes, you know, and I'm not expecting, you know, that we borrow it, especially now, you know, public loan doors nowhere near as attractive as it used to be. So, you know, we need to kind of seek those opportunities. So how long will it take to come through? Well, all of those things take 6 months to 1 year. They're all ongoing processes, and this may not fill you with glee, but and I know you want an economic development plan sooner rather than later, but in a way, I kind of see component parts to the plan now, because we're dependent on these other work streams kind of slip.
It's okay, I can see a Gantt chart growing. That would be, no, that's basically it, isn't it? It's like eventually you're going to need to start saying 2024, we need to start thinking about this, this part of the sector. Yeah, thank you. But where would you say at the moment the current gaps are in the council's measures metrics? Not just generally, bearing in mind what we see, and we've asked this before about an inclusive growth strategy, is that it's a lot of ambition, but not clear what success is going to look like.
Well, so part of the challenge that's been given to me is to define what we're going to deliver in economic development terms that makes the inclusive economy ambitions real, you know, because I've said this before, I absolutely agree with the sentiment of the inclusive economy strategy, but there isn't really a delivery mechanism within it. So I need to make those real. I think that will take the form of perhaps priorities or challenges. I quite like the structure of the climate action plan, actually, and maybe that approach, applying that to economic development. So being clear on the challenges and then creating the measures. And that can be near-term activity, because if we we can have an action within the economic development plan which talks about reviewing our property portfolio in a certain time scale with the aim of achieving X, Y, Z. So we can have those what I would call enabling activities. So it doesn't actually deliver anything in itself, but it paves the way for intentional delivery in the future.
Any further questions? Thank you for coming back, Councillor Walker. Councillor Toto.
I have a very good question. Might not actually be relevant, but I'll ask it. As you explained, consultations keep coming back to mind. What role do consultations will play in metrics? Is there a relationship? Do they feed anything when it comes to final metrics or in the plans? Thank you.
I think it depends on the kind of consultation, to be honest. So, for example, and this isn't necessarily consultation, but we're doing a large-scale random sample business survey, about 1,200 responses, so it'll be statistically relevant. We haven't got the results of that. The fieldwork's completed, and I think we've hit the 1,200 across the various quotas for the sectors. But so, for example, that could throw up certain challenges maybe businesses are referring to, which would then lead to a priority that we might look at if it's within our wheelhouse of levers, as it were, and then it would feed through to a metric. If you're talking about using consultation as the measure, i.e. we say we want a certain percentage of businesses to be satisfied with Hackney Council as a placemaker or something, or providing leadership, then we can do that. Personally, I don't in favour of that kind of measure, but we can do it. So some local authorities have that kind of measure, and it takes you down the path of increasing numbers of business engagement events to make businesses feel comfortable and engaged and heard. My slight challenge to that is the metric leading the activity? What is the intention? If you're clear about the intention of the business engagement, then I'd be comfortable with it. But if it's engagement just to make businesses happy so that they respond well when you next do that survey, you can sometimes see this, you can spot it a mile off. You see a whole bunch of business engagement activity, the survey's done like 2 months later, when it's fresh in everyone's mind, you get a positive response.
Which at times has been a criticism. Sorry. Thank you very much. That's been helpful. And I guess that's the reason why I'm asking this question, because at times we have heard residents or businesses that say, well, you know, this consultation kind of did have this question that led to an answer you might wanted to hear. And then how much of these consultations do have open questions where there is a free sort of quantitative or qualitative response to that?
Yeah, so I generally draw a line between consultation and engagement.
Yeah.
I see them as quite separate, different definitions. We could spend a whole session on that.
Yeah, great. I'm aware I have broken my own rule and run over. So there's one other question that I think would just, if we couldn't have a written response, particularly on developing an evaluation framework for area regeneration activity. We wanted to ask whether there's best practice or learning on that. But I think if we could get that in a written form, that would be helpful. And then I'd like to move on to Councillor Cockburn and the cabinet question time, because we've started a bit late. I'm sorry. I apologise for that. We've got about 15 minutes to answer the questions that we gave you. We were reviewing our questions and realised that quite a lot of them were similar questions in different forms, which means that we hopefully have basically got a general idea about where we want to get to and what we want to understand. So a key element of the scrutiny function, as you know, is to hold the Mayor and Cabinet to account in public as part of the Cabinet question time session. Before we go any further, let's just welcome, we've got Deirdre Worrell, who's the Director of Neighbourhoods and Housing Finance, this here in support of Councillor Cockburn. And we also have Sam Kirk, Head of Sustainability and Environment, is joining us virtually, and Tyler Linton, who is Acting Head of Street Scene, who's also joining us virtually. So they may well answer questions in support of Councillor Cockburn. In the municipal year, the Commission holds a question time session with the Cabinet and senior officers to ask questions about performance and decision making within the council related to the cabinet members' portfolio areas within the remit of the Skills, Economy and Growth Scrutiny Commission. The purpose of this item is to hold the executive to account. For this meeting, the cabinet member of Environmental Transport was asked to provide information to the Scrutiny Commission about the work the council is doing in relation to the following: the Green New Deal, investment of £50 million to help reduce energy bills for residents and tackle toxic air pollution. And secondly, understanding the economic impacts of the new Green Deal. And thirdly, carrying out an impact analysis of low traffic neighbourhoods on local businesses. In relation to point 3, this was an addition following the last Skills, Economy and Growth meeting in February 23. The Commission asked if the Council had assessed the impact of LTNs on local businesses. The question was redirected for an update from Councillor Cockburn. So we've asked Councillor Cockburn to include this in his Cabinet Question Time update. So again, like I say, a welcome Councillor Cockburn and Deirdre to the room. Can I say thank you very much to Michael? You're very welcome to stay if you'd like. And
I'm part of the support package, I think.
yes, excellent. It's just as well we booked the whole excellent. Okay, so we'll commence this item of discussion with a response from Councillor Cockburn. You've got 15 minutes, and then we will open up to discussion and quite Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. I think given Michael's nice little warm up with the climate action plan, I was thinking actually you should give my update for me, but it's good to be here.
Another.
Yeah. Although it does very much interlink with our plans around the Green New Deal, and I'll sort of go to talk about that. Chair, if it's okay with you, I kind of want to take this. If it's okay, I'll do a sort of a general update where I'll try to respond to many of the questions, and then I'll try to do short statements for each of the questions, and then obviously we could provide a briefing note to the Commission on full. Obviously, as you all know, the Green New Deal is a £50 million investment that we committed to politically, obviously around our investment to tackling the climate crisis. That very much interacts with the Climate Action Plan, which is what the Council is bringing together. I don't want to go too much detail into the background of that because I know we're limited for time and you're all sort of very much aware of that. But the whole purpose of the Climate Action Plan is really to sort of draw that strategic framework across the Council and to really set our ambition on how we're going to reach net zero by 2030 on some council emissions and 2040 across borough-wide emissions. What I will say about the Climate Action Plan and how this relates to our Green New Deal is it's very much an evolving piece of work. So what we have done with the Climate Action Plan in terms of how we got here in the first place, and it just relates back to your question about the consultation and engagement with businesses, is obviously we've had a series of engagement and consultations that I've got to say. We've just ended a public consultation on the Draft Climate Action Plan, and that will be reviewed to be brought to Cabinet for May Cabinet, which we'll be looking to sort of adopt as a formal document to take forward. However, linked to that Climate Action Plan, there will be a 3-year local implementation plan, a local plan. And that implementation plan essentially will set out across all of those different thematic areas, including what we're going to talk about now, which is around the green economy, on what we're specifically going to do to help reach net zero. But the key thing to really mark here, and I really want to get it across, is that the conversation doesn't end there. Neither with businesses, neither with, because the other key part of this, as you know, Chair, as well, is this is constantly an evolving piece of work, new technologies emerging, new research, and what's really important for us across the bit within around economic development, what we're doing more broadly is about we're continuously sort of monitoring sort of those pieces of research, and we're developing that. So what we're hoping to do is once we've got the Climate Action Plan in place, we want to establish a net zero partnership, which essentially brings together business, third sector, and obviously the council. And the purpose of the net zero partnership essentially is really to help really define how we can support businesses and different sectors to sort of help reach net zero. Again, another complicated part of this, and I just think it's really important to sort of say this at the start, is as a council, we're obviously we're directly responsible for about 5 to 6% of emissions in the borough, 23% indirectly. The rest of it, 74%, is down to all of us in terms of how we travel, what we wear, how we eat, all those sorts of things. And that's why I was really very passionate about making sure that this is a Hackney Climate Action Plan as opposed to a Hackney Council Climate Action Plan, because we're going to be just scratching the surface in relation to this. So to come to your specific sort of specifics of questions, obviously the £50 million that we committed to, what you would have seen with the budget last week at full council was, and we went above and beyond that, so it's £61 million over the next 3 years. And how we sort of how that was divided is, and the way you got to look at it is capital spend specifically. So that will obviously inevitably have an impact on the council's direct emissions in helping us reach net zero. And and I'll give examples of what sorts of things that we're going to be spending on. But then there's the question about, which we'll come on to a bit later, is around what does that investment enable in sort of the private sector, and for residents, what does that mean? So, for example, if we're talking about the electric vehicle charging infrastructure and impact, what impact does that have, for example, on for our residents? If we're talking about community energy fund, what impact does that have, for example, for like the schools who have energy bills that they've got to pay? So there's that bit about enabling. And then obviously the other bit about the climate action plan, and this is really important to understand why it interlinks with the Green New Deal, is just because there's a bit about aspiration. And I think there's a bit about, that's what the climate action plan will set out, which is around being honest with the public about what we're able to achieve, where we've got funding and what we haven't got funding for. But if the funding is unlocked, we've got the plans to move forward. And a good example of this, obviously, is, you don't need me to sort of tell you more about it, but it's about retrofit. The challenge we have with retrofit in London, which is on average, a property costs about 100 grand to fully retrofit. I believe in London, I think it's about 112 billion pounds required, and I think the only available funding we have is about 2 billion across London. Just shows the sort of the scale of the challenge that we face, and there's obviously further complexities sort of that goes into that. So just to summarize on the funding bit, there's the bit which is around the funding will go towards what's already planned for. So those allocations are being made through the capital program. So those, for example, like our own fleet, for example, is really important things. There's the business cases. So, for example, what we're doing around like cycle hangers, the return on investment that you get, particularly around in energy technologies, especially in sort of councils, non-housing sort of stock. And then obviously the bit which I spoke about, the sort of the aspiration linked to that. What I will do now, Chair, if it's okay, I'll sort of attempt to sort of maybe take us through each question, just so I'm not missing anything. And then, as I said, we could provide more details moving forward. So just to deal with the quick question about the timeline for the spend and the areas planned for this investment. So the timeline, as I say, the spend is committed for 3 years. The delivery may be 3 to 5 years. That's just because, for example, like if you look at the LED lights that we had installed, for example, that took a bit long to deliver, but the funding was spent and we knew that it was going to be delivered to reach 100% LED lights in the budget previously. There's obviously a 60 million, going to your first question around how much of the £50 million investment is intended to support the local economy, in what way. So there's obviously £61 million committed towards achieving our net zero target as part of the 23-24 budget that we've spent. This obviously is a capital investment that I have said. Having said that, we do have an approach to procurement, which is really important to notice, which is to highlight, which is obviously we use our purchasing power and our procurement system to obviously be able to make sure that these are benefiting local people, creating local jobs, apprenticeships, helping improve skills in the borough, and obviously helping support businesses. And obviously want to make sure that, as part of that, how it interacts with London living wage and all sorts of things. What I would say, just in relation to that specifically, and I'll talk about some of the challenges that we are facing, is that although our procurement strategy, a sustainable procurement strategy, and our aspiration is to sort of obviously support local businesses, SMEs, and create those jobs locally, it's not always the case that we have the required skill in the borough to deliver it. And a good example of that is, for example, through our Green Homes programme, the installation of fully insulation, heating, for example, solar, for example. One of the challenges that we have found is that we don't have the capable companies within the borough to be able to deliver that program at the scale that we need to be able to reach net zero. I think there's a bit to do around how we can develop that capacity within the borough, but those are some of the challenges that we are facing. I think there are potential areas for support for the local economy, and this is the bit about the enabling bit, which is around how we can support SMEs securing through right through the investment. There's the bit about how businesses could benefit. So obviously we've got the Zero Emissions Network, which is the partnership between Hackney, Tower Hamlets, and Islington. I believe it's the 3 boroughs. And this is basically helping businesses deliver on their last mile. We've got the cargo bike sharing program, which is the first in the UK. Obviously, the EV infrastructure. So again, helping support businesses move more green by, you know, greening their fleets. And obviously, in order for them to do that, we need to make sure that we've got the right electric vehicle charging point infrastructure. Obviously, also plugging into the mayor's scrappage scheme and obviously making the case for that. There's obviously raising awareness of external grants for businesses to increase energy efficiency for the properties, and so on and so forth. So we're doing lots of different work, and, you know, utilizing the Hackney Business Network, for example, to be able to do that. But again, it's an area that we still need to go further on. I should say that there are parts of this conversation that also sort of link in with across different portfolios across the council, but that's part of the beauty of the climate action plan, which hopefully it brings all of us working together through the environmental sustainability board that Michael has mentioned. By the way, Chair, do tell me if how I'm doing for time whenever you see me.
You're about halfway through.
Okay, brilliant. So I've got plenty of time. So I dealt with that question. So the next one is, I spoke about the timeline around this. Again, you know, we spoke about the what assessment has been made to the impact of this investment to the local economy. So the reality is obviously we're at the very early stages, like as I said, the kind of investment that we need to be needs to be sort of linked directly to the delivery of projects, specifically. And a good example of that is what we're planning in the Chatsworth area, which is around, you know, for example, how do we make sure that we sort of, what we need to do as a council, and it goes back to Michael's point when we were talking about metrics and how we understand what we're doing, is about how do you have, you know, some of these overarching strategies, which are very complex and have so much different interfaces, because there are some of them are already committed within what we do as a council in our day-to-day, what we want to enable locally. But what we need to get to is around how do you make sure that you sort of that those metrics are designed, you understand the impacts of those assessments through the delivery of localized schemes, and how you can kind of link that back to overall strategy, which I think is something that we are working towards. So there are different investments that will have different economic dynamics, and so, you know, we are looking at how that impacts on the £50 million specifically. One of the things that we are looking at is about how we could develop a evidence base of Hackney green businesses. So we're looking into research into businesses in the green economy specifically. I know that the current data, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's about indicates that there are less than 500 businesses active in the green economy. What we'll hope to do through this research is obviously to check this and to add to our understanding, and a borough-wide business phone survey with some relevant questions will be sort of taken to move forward. And what we're looking to do is obviously have limited funding for business support and grant making for 440k over 2 years through the Shared Prosperity Fund, and this will help support in terms of helping answer that specifically too. Coming to your next question, which is around, again, you know, similar to the point about the understanding the impacts, economic benefits of the investment. Again, we're at the very early stage because we are still very much at the start of just developing the climate action plan. There are a lot of national analysis that we are plugged into that obviously will help us develop that work. But the key thing is how do we sort of like understand, you know, what is that baseline that we're going to measure against? And until we get that baseline, I think it's sort of, you know, we're not really, you know, how do you measure what you're doing good be what we should be doing? And I think obviously Hackney is very different to different parts of the country. We need to understand what is Hackney's baseline, and how do we look back in 3 years' time and say we've moved forward from just under 500, for example, green businesses to say 800. If we don't do that baseline, you know, we may be on 500 in 3 years' time. I think it's great, but we don't have that baseline to sort of measure against, and I think that's really important to sort of understand. But there was a question about how much of the investment is being deployed to support local businesses. I did mention through our procurement processes, obviously we can't prejudge what the outcomes of those may be, so it's not something that we know yet. I do believe that 24% of procurement is currently towards local business, which is a really good figure. I suspect that the number of environmental or green businesses is much lower, and again, I think that's what we're trying to sort of scope out. But I think the piece of the puzzle which I'm hoping comes across to the Commission is that, you know, we want to obviously encourage more and more, but we want to deliver, you know, these environmental policies through local people and through local businesses. the challenge we have is obviously is the know-how on how to sort of on how to deliver on that, and that's something that we're going to have to sort of grapple with as we move forward. There was a question about, will any of the investments go efforts towards reducing energy bills and carbon emissions for local businesses? Again, you know, there are a number of different things that we are doing. One of the things that we're looking to do is to develop an area-based local area energy plan, and it engages anchor organisation, businesses and residents in its production. We want to develop, you know, a program of works to improve community heating networks, which again will help support businesses, and create heat networks with the potential to assist all household and businesses to help decarbonise around that. And then there's the additional bits that I spoke to around the reducing of transport emissions, you know, what we're doing around the, which I won't repeat, but about the zero emissions specific network as well. And I believe I've covered.
You have, and you're on time.
Perfect. Officers may want to come in if I've missed out any specific details, but I hope that sort of gives you an overall picture of where we are.
Thank you very much, Councillor Coburn. Is there anything specific that you'd like to add, Deirdre, Michael, Sam, or Tyler? And if so, I'm happy to take those now. If not, we'll go to questions. Deirdre?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I think the point I want to make about delivering on this agenda is very complex. And when we look at the commitments that have already been made, that is capital based. But when we come to see the approval of climate action plan, you will see the commitments for those enabling activities on the revenue side.
Yeah.
So what we're looking at is the capital investment, and that tends to go to the bigger groups. So when we talk about the 24% of all procurement activity, we need to understand whether that's mostly revenue. If you take home care providers, they're more likely to be local. So we just need to make sure we get that piece right. But it is good that 24% of our procurement spend goes into the local area. So there is a piece of work to be done there. So it's a very complex piece. And the investment we have at the moment is only capital, but we have got those enabling activities that we've picked up in the climate action plan. It's very complex, and there's lots of projects that can be talked about.
I think it's really, really helpful for us to distinguish that tonight we're looking specifically at what we're now talking about, £61 million capital spend over 3 years, and that the delivery will take longer. It's very different from your enabling powers and levers as an administration, and also your revenue spend on things like how people do their jobs, how you commission services, etc. So as long as the County Commission is very clear about that, we can probably carry on. But it's a useful and important clarification from you, Deirdre. Councillor Potter.
Thank you for that presentation, very thorough. Looking forward to also hearing the climate action plan when it's announced. Oh, sorry. A couple of questions just coming out of what you said. So you probably know by now that I'm quite keen on the green home side of things, given my construction background. I mean, it's a national problem in terms of capacity to deliver the national agenda on green homes, not just in Hackney. But I'm interested, you did talk about enabling capacity or developing capacity, and I just wondered whether you could outline, within a limited context that we have here in Hackney, any ideas on what that might look like. And the other thing I just wanted to ask, you talked about the 500 green businesses. Sorry if I missed it, but you could just have some examples. Obviously, you've got metrics on that because you've come on with the 500 businesses. Is that businesses that identify as green, or that as part of your work, Michael, you've identified 500 businesses? That'd be good to know a little bit of detail on who they are and what kind of service area, etc. Thank you.
Great question. Did you want me to come back straight away on this?
Yes, please.
I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Potter. Really good question. And just to clarify, so you mean the capacity to sort of deliver on some of those projects?
Yes.
On the yeah. So, for example, I'll give you an example on the Community Energy Fund. When we first came out with the Community Energy Fund, part of the reason how it was born about was because of the project that Stokey Energy delivered on Stokely School, where it had funding from GLA, local community energy group, delivering on a need for helping green, obviously, a school estate, which was a great model, right? And that sort of gave us the aspiration to say, hey, can we take this and do it on scale? Now, immediately, one of the challenges that we immediately noticed was we offered 300k grants to do, part of it was about feasibility study on estates, but then also to deliver. The challenge we realized was that Stokey Energy was the only active community energy group. And part of the aim of the Community Energy Fund wasn't just about getting solar on the estates, but it's actually about how you create green local jobs owned by the community, but also benefit the estate by lower energy bills. So in the end, if you wanted to complete the project, you either had to do all Stokey Energy if they've got the capacity to deliver all of the projects, or you're going to have to start to look outside of the London Borough of Hackney. What we have linked to that, though, what we have started to do, so we noticed this, so what Hackney Light and Power embarked on is basically delivering a number of workshops to establish other community energy groups. And what we've done was we tapped into the existing sort of TRAs and other networks to use Stokey Energy as a model, help support them to understand how you establish a community energy group, and essentially help support them as a council to create many other Stokey Energies across the borough, so that we create this revolution of green jobs, help community energy, and so on and so forth. And so that's the sort of thing that we're looking to do. I think the problem with the Green Homes program specifically, and the delivery that we're facing there in terms of like making sure it's local businesses, is obviously, I think it's a nationwide problem of talent that we have generally on delivering solar and insulation and heating into homes. So that's something that we're looking into. But I think it's also part of work that fits within the London Council's program, which I know that there's work around understanding how do you sort of like create a skill force in London. And then obviously for us, it's about the question about Hackney to be able to deliver that. But we do need to sort of outline a plan in terms of a green job plan, which is, you know, the conversation I always have with the chair. Chair's always sort of like being very sort of robust about this, which is around, you know, it's all good talking about green jobs, but until you define it and actually make it sound very real for people, we're not really saying anything substantive other than sort of, you know, create green jobs. What does it mean for the people of Hackney?
My insight from that is that even stuff like Community Energy Fund, where you want to actually spend it on the capital kit,
Yeah,
to get on top of roofs, you need some revenue funding to spend on people in order for them to know how to do the stuff that's required.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so this £61 million is fine, but we'll need some revenue in order to be able to unleash it.
Yeah.
Councillor Walker, did you have a question?
So just
Oh, sorry.
on the second question,
Oh, sorry,
Michael,
yeah,
still having on the
yeah.
businesses.
Yes, the work's ongoing. We're expecting the reports. We did start with about 500 odd from an experimental database that we've got access to. We've got Oxford Economics, you may have heard of, so nationally renowned data research company, cleaning that data for us. Unfortunately, they've cleaned it down to about 317. There's one kind of example, there's a company called Intergen, which appear on the data about 8 times because they've obviously started, failed, or they're involved in some kind of strange tax dodge, who knows. So we're starting, I just had a presentation this afternoon, so I'm only referring to it on my screen now. So in terms of those kind of sectors, you know, we're still cleaning it, and I think the number might get a bit lower because obviously in Shoreditch you have a lot of HQ registrations. So there are quite a number of power businesses and they're registered in the Shoreditch area. They are probably not engaged in Hackney activity. So of no use to our kind of agenda and our investment. But for our other ESG angle, there may be an interesting route, but that's a conversation for another day. We have quite a lot of, as you can imagine, kind of consultancies, so climate change strategy consultancies. And I'll come on to some of the complications in a moment. We have, and officers and Councillor Cover know this, we have, you know, quite a healthy, actually, kind of circular economy segment. The consultants call it reduce, reuse, recycle. We've got about 50 or so that come through the data, and then another half a dozen that come through a supplementary survey. So we kind of building this out. One thing that did surprise me is we have very few green finance organisations. I was expecting that to be high because of Shoreditch, but it's only about a dozen or so of those. And then when it starts to get tricky is, so you will have architects, and it's impossible for us to define from the data whether it's an architect following standard practice, standard government regulations, and obviously the regs are pushing us towards green and energy, etc. Or are they kind of innovators and pioneers who are going further than the regulatory requirements? And then I would define them as genuinely green. The others are just architects following regs, but that's not a live debate. Officers and my colleagues, we disagree on it, to be frank, and we've got to resolve that. So the data is coming through, but it is not a big feature of the Hackney economy. And just going through, I think the back to kind of Deirdre's point, Councillor Coban's point, is when we look at the kind of capital schemes in the commissioning, it doesn't look to me like the capacity is there locally. I asked the consultants to try to identify companies that might be engaged with the retrofit agenda, and they said there were eight possibilities on their list, and we would need to do a proper check on their website and see whether they are or not. So it is a challenge and it is complicated. I still think we should try it and go through the process, but we can't expect the magic wand to be waved and for it to just slot into it.
That's very helpful. Councillor Patton's got a follow-up, and then I think Councillor Tevatala has to
You might have kind of answered it. My follow-up was, are there any businesses or sole trader in the construction sector who are going to carry out some of the green homes works that you've been able to identify? But it sounds like you've possibly got 8 businesses that you think might be involved in that sphere.
Yeah, and what I'd add to that, and I've done some work on construction in kind of previous lives, as it were, and so it's about supply chains. So if you've got a large retrofit program, you're probably talking about a tier 1 contractor, so a large contractor, and they will operate nationally, and then they will have their supply chain. So they quite often have their supply chain in place already with pre-negotiated agreements, and that's how it all works. And so through our procurement rules, we could try to disrupt that a bit, but it's very difficult to plug in other contractors. Now, my brother works in construction, and if you're Hackney-based kind of construction, either a sole trader, you don't think about Hackney. You think about, who are my connections, who rings me up. It's a very person to person, and it's about your phone list. And they might live in Hackney, but they might do all their work in Essex, for example, and they'll always work there because the contracts drop into their lap. It's a very kind of complex landscape to negotiate.
Yeah. And that's a useful temper to our sort of instincts to make sure that everything is as local as possible. Councillor Narcos, sorry, Councillor Tevatala, Councillor Narcos, and then Councillor Webb, have you got a question? No. Okay, Tevatala.
Thank you so much. My question is related to FDN and local businesses, and specifically with their economic growth. And this is because we are now seeing often shops that either enter with less stock on the shelves, with less customers, which could be because there's been a shift as well in how people consume as well, more online. My question is related to whether we have data on how LTNs may impact business growth or not. Do we have data on that? How is that supporting local businesses, or is maybe posing challenges in terms of busier roads in certain bottleneck areas and certain roads have become a bit more busier in traffic, but people might not be able to we have noticed, and I hear residents saying, well, I don't have the time now to go and shop for long, say Matalan, now I have to really measure my time because the traffic is heavier. So I'm just checking in how, although LTNs, the concept is brilliant for what we need to achieve for the environment, for our Pachamama, but do we also look into this? We're keen to hear. Thank you.
Yeah. Just be on mic. Thank you, Councillor. Great question. So absolutely, it's a very, very important question. What I would say, and I'll just be very clear about this as well, obviously part of the aspiration of the low traffic neighbourhood schemes, it's about improving air quality and helping obviously reducing, helping protect the lungs of our children. But it's also about reviving our neighbourhoods and really creating neighbourhoods that people want to live in. And, when they're walking down the street, they're not just rushing to get home and actually enjoying that journey, make sure they've got good public realm, maybe they've got good local shops and cafes and everywhere where they can go and sit down. So that's the sort of the intent that I would say to you in terms of a statement. The challenge is is how do you attribute the impact of such transport scheme to sort of a direct economic output? And we've had this question raised by the scrutiny before, and it's a challenge that I brought back to office to say we've got to bring, you know, regen and street scene to work much more closely together to understand that when we are going to make interventions, transport interventions, we're able to understand and work with what are the implications are going to be. So those are ongoing stuff that is happening where we're trying to work across London to try to understand, you know, what are the impacts of LTNs on businesses. The challenge is there is no, it's difficult to quantify that. What I would say is if you look at, for example, in Stoke Newington, the Stoke Newington scheme specifically, on Stoke Newington, you would have seen that since we brought in the low traffic neighbourhood scheme, because part of bringing the Stoke Newington low traffic neighbourhood scheme was about revitalising Church Street. Because Church Street used to be, when I was growing up, a place where you would want to go to do a shop or go to, you know, to a nice cafe with your family and friends and have a nice, you know, meal for lunch or for dinner. And the reality is, obviously, you know, in the last 10, 15 years, there've probably been more desirable locations than Church Street in comparison to other parts of Hackney, for example, Shoreditch and Hackney Wick and other parts. And so when we obviously went in there with the intervention around widening the pavements, for example, upgrading the crossings, the community parklets that typically cost, for example, a lot of money for businesses to install so that, you know, their customers can benefit from actually sitting outside in those community parklets to actually enjoy their food or their drinks, was about revitalising Church Street. And what we have seen on Church Street is that footfall is up by 18%. Cycling is up by roughly about either 36 or 39%. Tyler's on the call and he may actually want to, he's our head of acting director of street scene, he may want to sort of correct me on that. So as a result of that, what we do know is there's more people are on Church Street now on foot than any time previously before. Now, the challenge is, and I actually saw this tweet today, which I said that I think there's only less than 3% of occupancy available in Church Street, which is the lowest it's ever been. And in comparison to the London-wide trend, which I think is 16%, which shows, you know, like the success of how Church Street is actually doing very well. The challenge is obviously, can you directly say that's as a result of the LTN? Because there is no direct link that sort of brings those two things together. So we can't necessarily attribute that to the LTN, but what I would say is, as a local councillor in Stoke Newington, and obviously as someone who's been very close to the Stoke Newington scheme, certainly the impact of the low traffic neighbourhood scheme is that, you know, I remember as a kid growing up in Stoke Newington, it was never that buzzy on the weekend, for example. When you walk down there on the weekend now, there's just so many people on foot and more likely to shop locally. So that's the sort of the sort of anecdotal, I guess, sort of perspective from my end. As I said, the bit that we're challenged with, and maybe Tyler wants to come in on this point, is not just in Hackney but also across London, is how you can directly attribute the impact of LTNs on regen. The final thing I would say on this point before we move on, because I know lots of questions, is as I said, we heard the Commission very loud and clear last time around the need for regen and street scene to work together, and future schemes, for example, the Chatsworth scheme that we're looking into. You know, we've got a very successful market intervention there, for example. And, you know, one of the things that I've been asking the officers to do is how to work across sort of the market, street scene, all the other interventions that are going to happen as well. Because, you know, for a resident, they don't look at different departments. They look at the council's coming to install electric vehicle charging points, do street trees, they're going to retrofit this estate, or they're going to do a parking removal there, or they're going to do this there, or markets there. They look at it as a council. So one of the things that I'm speaking to officers is basically, before we do go into any of these places, can we just like make sure we're fully coordinated? And when we have these consultations, we're talking about this as a package of intervention, and actually really have those localized, you know, I wouldn't call it citizen assemblies, but localized deliberative democracy engagement activities in those neighborhoods, where you can think through what does a net zero what does a net zero carbon neighborhood in Chatsworth look like, in the Chatsworth area, and you look at all of those things and you map it out for residents so that they've got a direction of travel. So I'll end there, but Tyler would probably want to come in specifically on the
Tyler?
Yes, just on the point about data points and Stoke Newington LTN. Off the back of the challenge from this group last year, as Councillor Cockburn said, we did include economic assessment in our assessment of the experimental scheme in Stoke Newington, as the timing of that scheme aligned with challenge from this group. Now, when we talk about economic appraisal of transport schemes, there is a sort of fundamental principle of proportionality, and there are a lot of different assessments that can be done for transport schemes. Typically, something of this size wouldn't get a full sort of DFT level economic appraisal that you might do for a Crossrail 2, something like that. So within the sort of framework of proportionality, what we did do is, working with the Regen team, we got access to data from the GLA's High Streets data service in the form of anonymized MasterCard spending data. And we're able to use that as one proxy of information for spend. As Councillor Coban said, that's sort of one piece of the puzzle, and we want to be careful about drawing very, very strong conclusions from that. But between pre-pandemic levels and post-LTN levels, MasterCard spending in Church Street went up by more than 200%. And some of that might be from changing spending patterns from cash to card, and some of that might be from inflation. But it is fair to say that alongside the other information we have about footfall and anecdotal evidence, that it does sort of point to a picture of economic success, there is also a long and well-established academic history of studies looking at pedestrian spending, and it from sort of systematic reviews of different studies over the years, there's a strong body of evidence that when you improve a high street area for pedestrians, spending does tend to go up. There's sort of evidence of that over time. So with that body of evidence, and using the sort of proportionality test, we've gone and used the MasterCard spending as our sort of main metric to assess the impact of Stoke Newington LTN, and ultimately we did assess that it was a positive impact on retail.
Thank you, Tyler. I'd like to hear from Michael as well. He wants to say something.
It's only a minor point, but just go back to what I said in kind of my earlier presentation about the IGP Prosperity Index, and think about the broader measures of the economy. So it's not just about the businesses and their turnover, although that is important, but those health metrics, Councillor Coban returns, covered them. It's like if people feel better about themselves, there's actually an economic value in that more broadly, and that's Tyler referenced it, but it's all in those studies. And there's, I've just quickly Googled one here, but the University of Westminster are actually doing very interesting studies focusing on health rather than economy. But they've, we've talked about counterfactuals before. They've actually got a control area, which is the same as the area of the LTNs, kind of demographically, geographically, where the LTN hasn't been implemented, and then that's a live study due to report in a couple of years. So, to be honest, I don't think we need to do a Hackney specific study. I think there's plenty of London level studies, as Tyler was saying, that we can reference and be sure it's the right thing to do. I have a very quick anecdote from my visit to Amazon's electric hub just the other week that I know Tyler was involved in setting up, and they told me very clearly that when they ran their kind of metrics on their deliveries, when you were putting the LTNs in, they actually, the LTNs going in drove their change and their shift to using electric bikes for deliveries, because it's just a simple economic decision of the bikes are quicker than the vans. And I've had the policy person there told me that FedEx is doing something similar now. So off the back of this positive policy intervention, it's driving wider change.
Yeah.
Which goes again to our enabler of using our levers most effectively.
Sorry. One last thing I would say is, having said all of this, I don't think we should be in a position where we're sort of gloating about success of our LTNs. There will be different experience for different businesses depending on the nature of their business. And one of the things that we have been doing very closely, actually specifically in Stoke Newington, given that we're talking about it now, is working very closely with Stoke Newington Business Association to understand those different impacts on different businesses. So I don't think as a council, we should be sort of going out there and saying, oh, look, LTNs are the greatest things that's ever happened and it's working for every single business, because the reality is there may be businesses that have a different nature of operating that will be impacted differently. And I think, you know, our role as a council is making sure that we're able to listen, reflect, and try to improve these schemes to make it the best possible version it could be, whilst finding those balance across all those different areas.
Thank you. I want to ask questions separate from the LTN, so I'll hear from Councillor Walker now.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to come in on that really, just as a sort of follow-up, because obviously, yes, the experience of different businesses is at different areas across the borough, and I'm thinking specifically around some of our boundary roads. And you mentioned before around the work you're doing with the zero emission network across boroughs. And I'm just sort of wondering if you could say a little bit more just around that piece of work going forward, and the engagement particularly with Islington, Tower Hamlets, which are, you know, two of our key boroughs, and it's complex because they're going to have different priorities, they're going to have different agendas, and how we sort of marry that up to ensure that particularly sort of boundary roads where businesses are impacted in a different way are, you know, making sure that they're being heard, engaged with, and actually getting to resolve it.
That's a great question, Councillor Walker. I think just in response, I think there's two parts to this. So there's the bit about, and I think this is really important for across all the different things that the Commission's been talking about today, which is around the monitoring of everything we do. So we're committed to doing more and more monitoring around air quality data, around traffic counts, specifically on the boundary roads. What we have seen is that main road traffic is down by 6% comparison to pre-pandemic, which is obviously positive. Having said that, again, you know, these are like broad stats that look across the borough. There will be specific areas that will be impacted negatively. So, for example, we look at like, you know, Norfolk Road in Hackney Downs, for example, where we've seen a slight increase of cars, and we need to be able to sort of, as a council, be able to sort of understand, reflect, and make a change. And I think, you know, we've done a lot of changes across all of our low traffic neighbourhood schemes that recognise we're looking at this scheme by scheme whilst trying to draw the bigger picture. On the zero emission network specifically, and a partnership that we have with Islington and Tower Hamlets, obviously Tower Hamlets, since we established the zero emission network, have taken a very different course of direction in terms of their Healthy Streets programme is concerned, and, you know, what they're doing in terms of rolling back around school streets and the low traffic neighbourhoods interventions. We're still very much committed to the work that we're doing around the zero emission network and help us support businesses on their last mile. We obviously had the UK's first ever cargo bike sharing scheme, which went live in London Fields, Stoke Newington, and Hoxton, Shoreditch area. What we are now doing is I believe we're in the process of actually expanding that zero emissions network in terms of our fleet of cargo bikes in the borough. And actually, without sort of wanting to prejudge, actually, Tyler, I don't know if I'm allowed to say the bit about what Michael spoke about, you know, about the company that I'm referring to, but we're looking at expanding that cargo fleet. But we're also working with businesses like Amazon, for example. So Amazon, you know, you would have seen last year they announced their intention to trial in Hackney to start doing delivery via cargo bikes. Again, it sort of links to the partnership we have, both regen and economic development, and obviously street scene and transport to reduce transport emissions. We're helping facilitate that by providing sites where they can store some of these cargo bikes. One of the things that me and Tyler often speak about, and one of the things that we have an aspiration for Hackney, and actually it's in the plans around the Green New Deal, is around how do we create, you know, when you look at the couriers across Hackney, you know, and across London, there is a different type of economy that exists out there where, you know, you've got much more delivery drivers going around, and what we need to do is be able to adapt as a council to understand what sort of spaces that do we create, where, you know, we have that balance between residential areas, but people who need to go about and doing their jobs, and how do we create micro mobility hub centres where, for example, you've got delivery hubs essentially we're able to use it, including for couriers, make sure that they've got shelters, good conditions, and we're very early stages of that. But, you know, the Amazon part of that is the very much start of the journey that we're hoping to take.
Can I just clarify, we're not actually using any of our capital expenditure to do things that Amazon could spend money on themselves. Just
that's correct. We're not using any of our expenditure.
Oh, that was a worry. Just wanted to be clear about that. We're giving them land, but they can build their own stuff.
Sorry, I should have clarified. We're not giving them land. I believe it's their
mission.
Is it, Tyler, do you want to come in on this
Sorry,
specifically?
I'm just very clear that I don't want to be doing Jeff Bezos anything.
No.
It's their own land. It was just
It's their land. So
supporting
what we're
supporting
doing-
them with a change of use.
Sorry?
It was just the council supported them with a change of use of their own land.
Right, which again goes to our levers. I'm going to ask a really basic question about this 61 million quid. Sorry, but John can go first.
Yeah, so mine was kind of going back to the sort of some of the procurement stuff we were talking about earlier. Obviously, you said one of the issues with procurement is the lack of the skills that you need to procure within Hackney. I guess there's a lot of businesses who can provide sort of the skills and services that we're looking for. I imagine there's probably like another tier of businesses that could, with some support, move into that green business space. You mentioned kind of architects as an example. With some support, some of those architects that aren't green architects, as you would call them, could be green architects. Or there's, I imagine other businesses that could sort of step in with, with a bit of support, whether it's training or whatever. What we've been sort of done to identify kind of that level of skills and services within the borough, and what kind of, if any, part of this is about kind of providing that support to help them kind of come into that green space.
So if we refer specifically back to the Green New Deal capital spend, then as the spending plans emerge, there's basically a process to follow, as there is, and as you've heard me say before. So we understand the spending plans, we understand the specifications and things that need to be brought, and then our teams can collaborate on what's the local supplier analysis. So do the suppliers exist or not? And then certainly my team can do an assessment and engagement on whether they're capable of competing, and we should be thinking about this on a 3 to 5 year horizon here, because we might get lucky and there might be a supplier sitting there that can do it to the level we need, the quality we need, the scale we need, or not. But there might be a supplier there who, with some support over 2 to 3 years, can scale up and do it. So we need to understand those dynamics. And there's a couple of examples in the spend, which I think are good ones. So we talked about the bulb kind of changes. Like we don't have a light bulb manufacturer of that kind in Hackney. We're never going to have one. It's not our dynamic. So basically we cross it off the list and we move on and we go through and we focus our resource where there might be kind of meaningful interaction and a possibility to help them. But what I would say is if we do identify some businesses that need some support to scale up, we will need to go and seek the funding to help them to do it. So currently we have the existing round of UK SPF, we touched on the figures earlier, but we're talking really about the next round of UK SPF, and we don't know what will happen with national government then, whether there'll be another round of SPF or not. Certainly in year 3, it's back up to the RDF levels of money, unfortunately eroded by inflation. So we'll start to have more money. So I can't answer it directly, but I can tell you what the process is and how we can collaborate. And I think the Climate Action Plan process, which is associated, has brought us together much more. And through the implementation process, I don't know if you've read the CAP, but you'll see the green economy bit and the green skills bit is like an underpinning feature of the other elements rather than standalone. So the idea is that my team try to work the other teams, understand the economic dynamics. Dujon's team will understand the skills and labour dynamics, and we'll fit it all together.
Can I get back to the capital spend?
Yes.
61 million quid, what we're spending it on?
So,
because we've ended up asking a lot of questions about things that actually come out of the revenue, right? You've got 61 million quid to spend over 3 years. What are you spending on?
So there are a number of different things that we're spending on, obviously outlined in the budget. For example, some of the investments look at, for example, like green initiatives, like greening our housing estates, for example. So it's £2 million in that. There's a further 500k to deliver green screens in borough schools. There's 9.6 million to replace our fleet with green supply alternatives. Obviously the rollout of the free fund electric vehicle charging points as well, but a lot of it is embedded work, as Deirdre said, which you may want to come in on specific points as well.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I suppose within that 61 million, there's also a spend of 16.8 million on the decarbonisation of 8 council buildings. We were successful in getting some money out of the decarbonisation fund, 12.2 million pounds worth of grant to help us decarbonise Londonfields Lidos, Kiswell Leisure Centre, 2 primary schools, Stoke Newington, and some other Queensbridge Leisure Centre. So that was a very, put in a bid and we were successful. So that's 15 million there. Housing, there's 28 million pounds worth of investment in our asset management strategy for our housing stock. So where we've selected out over the next 3 years, those elements that could be green, so more efficient boilers. I know we want to phase out new boilers, but obviously the technology has to we've got to balance the technology and the cost of energy to our residents. So there's money there, and so you've got green initiatives, there's fleet, and
You've got the local area energy plan, which is improving community heat networks as well,
yeah. I mean, the heat networks element isn't within that 61 million because they're within the overall regeneration schemes. So we're not going to pick the 200 million or whatever millions we're going to do on the regeneration program.
Can I ask you just a follow-up question? Because I think what's really important about the whole concept of a Green New Deal, especially when we managed to secure £61 million, a lot of that in grant money, is what is the multiplier effect of that investment? How do we, because otherwise, if you're not careful, bearing in mind there is no money because of 60 million quid hole in the country's budget because of what happened last summer and everything else, all that happens is the money comes from national government. We secure it and we do those things. And that's really great. But bearing in mind how much else we've got to do, how does that become a driver to securing more money, more finance, more larger packages? Because we won't be able to cover what needs to be done solely in grant money. What is our vision for the Green New Deal investment to become a driver for greater investment across the community to achieve these things?
Do you want to come in first, or do you want me to go first?
You go first.
Go first. Okay, cool. Great question. That's a really good question, and that's exactly the sort of area that we need to be looking into, which is around how do we use the funding we have to enable more that multiplier effect, as you rightly say. One of the areas that obviously, again, it's sort of, you've got to look at this sort of in different parts, but I was in a meeting talking about, for example, how do we look at energy technology for our non-existing council estates, for example, and not our own stock, but sort of private stocks. And it's about looking at different financing models that can sort of enable that. So, for example, do you look at, for example, like climate bonds, the different engagement, the different models? And I know Camden done the climate bonds, went through that model, and I think they went through their first round.
Islington's got one as well.
Islington's got one as well, and that's an area that we're looking into. So, specifically to that, we're looking at 3 different financing models, obviously led by Hackney Light and Power, and hopefully, sort of in the summer of this year, we'll be in a position where we will have a route map forward that essentially really alludes to what you're sort of talking about, Chair, which is around the investment we put, how we tap into existing grants, but then also how do you then sort of make it more sustainable by creating a sustainable sort of a fundraising strategy which allows it to sort of multiply, and obviously it has viable sense, but also doesn't put the council at risk as well. So those are work that we're undertaking. Again, we're at the very early stages, and what we're hoping is that through the Green New Deal and the Climate Action Plan is, whether we're talking about the work we're doing around community energy, what we're doing around energy decarbonisation in our non-council housing stock, and all these different areas can really start to build those funding models for it.
Can I just draw this back to what we were talking about before about the metrics, right?
Yeah.
The success of the 61 million quid has to be another 61 million quid times something or other over the period of a decade or whatever. So what is your target for securing further finance? Or what is the target of your multiplier effect, right? Where and how are you assessing the money saved? Because carbon emissions saving, so carbon saving should also be money saving, and therefore how is that 61 million quid creating energy savings for either the council or for residents or businesses? I think those are really important questions.
They are.
Because if you're not going to have another 61 million quid to spend the next 3 years, or the 3 years after that. And especially since we know the scale of the task, if we've only got 2 billion quid over the whole of London, we've got to spend 200 billion quid. Our 61 million quid is a drop in the ocean. So therefore, how we can do that?
I'm doing the first.
And then I've got to bring in. I've taken out. I've reviewed the chair.
So just gone.
Councillor Walker, go on.
Just so so with that 61 million quid and how you make that into investment and going forward, it's also just around sort of cross-sector collaboration and partnership with different sectors who can also provide quite significant funding coming into that, and it'd be good to know further down the line, you know, what the sort of thinking around that is, in terms of how you sort of really build that into a strategy.
This is entrepreneurial municipalism, and distinguishes us, I think, as a council from many others. Sorry, I think Councillor Coveney then.
Do you want to go first, and then I'll come in to sort of summarise?
Yeah, so slightly pedantic clarification.
Good.
But can we be clear on what we mean by when we say local multiplier effect? To me, it means something quite specific, which is about, it's a certain kind of assessment, it's called LM3, and you track the spend as it goes through a supply chain.
No, I wasn't meaning that. I meant.
So and it's valid to
generate more money.
Yeah, so it's valid to do that. So some of the discussion around procurement would be local multiplier effect and benefits for our employment. So what you're talking about is kind of investment matching and leveraging investment.
Leveraging, it's better to use leveraging.
And so as we proceed, let's just be clear on which one we're doing and whether we're doing both and the degree, which is just my request.
No, that's very helpful, Michael, and I stand corrected. What I'm basically talking about is leveraging our grant money to access private investment.
Okay, I suppose the funding strategy that we're going to be form part of the CAP, and we've already mentioned it, is about what we do to deliver CAP using money as business as usual. What have we got business cases for that we can lever in private money, and what are the aspirational? So within that 61 million that we've just talked about, there is a gross spend of 16 million pounds for this decarbonisation fund. Our contribution is 4 million.
Right.
We have got 12.2 million pound grant funding. Right. So there you go. That 4 million has got, you know, three times that value, that 4 million. So that's 25%, 75%, 25%. So in our programme, whatever we've got to spend, we are going to seek external funding opportunities. So in terms of Chatsworth and that pilot estate, we've got potential pilot for retrofit there, or retrofit on 3 properties. We are seeking funding from 2 sources.
Can I just pick you up on that, Deirdre, because that's really helpful, but it is about a grant. It's match funding from grant, rather than are we being able to develop business models which mean that we will not be forever dependent on grant funding.
Yes.
That's the question.
So there's another one. So for example, the rollout of EV, touch points, that is a case in point. I think we're in about 900,000, which is within the capital plan, but that is more or less cash flowing it. It's not going to be funding that. We're going to get that back to go back into the PRA. So Tyler and his team are doing that procurement, and the model is that it gets rolled out and the supplier delivers that rollout over a period of time, and that resource comes back in.
I suppose my observation is it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning. If we just think of inputs and outputs rather than how does that money get bigger, or becomes cost neutral, an investment like the EV stuff becomes cost neutral and eventually becomes an income generator, are important questions for how capital investment is seen as really long-term valuable. And I think that's what, if we're talking about the Green New Deal, we really need to understand that what its long-term impacts are going to be on our economy, in terms of money saving, but also investment and income generation. And that would be really useful for us to understand about it, because if we're going to keep doing it, especially if Michael's going to come back and go, well, I didn't actually do as well as he says it would, then the administration might say, well, we're not going to do that again.
So just to
I
come.
mean, I'm not suggesting, Michael, that you have quite that much influence, but I think definitely our commission would want to ask some questions about it, about the effectiveness if it wasn't doing what it said it would do.
Yeah, I mean, just to come back and just sort of as an observation, and obviously, sorry, I thought, is obviously we've got Sam's going to come in as well. Before Sam, I'll quickly contribute and then I'll let Sam come in as well. It's obviously, I think, is, you know, Deirdre's obviously alluded to, that's happening on sort of scheme or project basis. What we're missing, as you said, is obviously sort of the, you know, like, what does that mean? So, like, we're talking about the Green New Deal and the climate action plan. What does that mean in terms of the overall bit? And I think that's something that we can certainly take away and look further into. The other bit which you mentioned, which is really important, which I'm surprised that we never sort of got more into it, is around the savings of carbon emissions. Because, for example, you know, like we were looking at, for example, if you look at our refuse trucks, right? A diesel truck costs £195,000 on average, and a fully EV one costs 450 grand. And if you retrofit one, so if you make it an EV, then I think it costs about 250, 300 grand, something about roughly like that. That's partly because obviously the cost of EV is very expensive to run right now and probably will get cheaper. But some of the decisions that we're going to have to make as a council is that those trucks, those diesel ones, have 10-year lifelines. Yeah. Now, we currently use vegetable oil, so it reduces the consumption by 92%. So it's still, you know, helping significantly reduce the carbon emissions in comparison to what diesel would be. But if you think, for example, in 2024, you're going to have 10 trucks that you need replacing, do you go out and say buy 10 EV ones that cost you probably 4 or 5 times the amount that you would buy for the other vehicles? But then the bit I think that we're not doing, Chair, is I think the bit you're saying, which is around, we need to start to quantify things in terms of the savings it has in terms of carbon emissions and the impact it has on our, not just look at everything through monitoring. It goes back to that point that, you know, when, for example, Michael was talking earlier about the sort of, when we talk about economic development and the impact of LTMs, is, you know, what are we talking about? And I think that's the bit we need to sort of really drill into. And I think that is an area that I think, you know, we need to go away with the climate action plan and really sort of try to understand, when we look at the metrics, how are we going to measure? Because it goes back to the point I made at the commission last time, which is, you know, for many people, we'll be asking them to sort of change the way in which they, you know, essentially live their life. And, you know, they will always say to us, well, you know, like, Mete, why are you telling me, for example, you know, why are you targeting me? I'm the little man in this conversation. Go target the big companies. And I think if you want the Green New Deal or the climate action plan to be successful, we're going to have to be able to go back to people and say, you see all of these things that we've been doing as a council, or you see all of these things that you've been doing as an individual to help support the environment and the planet. Here is what the impact of it has been so far. And unless we can go back and do that, you know, people won't be able to. It's like, you know, like, for example, if I know this is a really bad analogy, so apologies for the members, but like, you know, when you're trying to, for example, you know, like if you're trying to lose weight or anything like that, and you see progress goals, it motivates you to do more. And I think we've just got to be able to sort of essentially be able to do that in this context. And I think we're not quite there yet. I think it's something that we need to take away. But I'll let Sam come in.
And then Councillor Potter.
Thank you. I'll just come in on that last point first. There is actually some metrics, but I think they're being updated as to the carbon cost of not doing certain things. And I think the GLA had some metric there, but I do think it's being updated. But it is certainly something that we need to look at with within the climate action plan going forward. And I know that we're coming back to the Commission in July to discuss the climate action plan. The other point I was going to make, going back to investments, is just to let the Commission know, if you don't know already, that Hackney does actually sit on the advisory board for the 3CI, which is the city's investment. And there is 5 programmes on there that are looking, and it's purely about financing, but looking at net zero neighbourhoods. We've actually put in a bid for some funding through the Innovative UK Fast Followers programme, which we did last week. There's also looking at national net zero pipeline projects, but also national technical assistance programme, which is looking at the creation of a development fund that invests in the necessary capacity and skills to bring projects forward for investment. And alongside that, and Ian Williams is the project sponsor, is regional investor events. I believe that there's a meeting tomorrow that the mayor will be attending, but I just wanted to let the commission know that that may be a way forward. It's not, I don't know how long this advisory board has been set up for, but I think it's in the initial stages because they're just looking at sign off for those 5 different projects.
Thank you. Councillor Fox. Sorry to bring you back to more micro stuff. We've just been talking about the bigger picture. With to end on, but I couldn't resist. We talked previously about enabling capacity, particularly about around retrofit and construction. Was the previous question I asked, and I want to put back at you a little bit, Michael, in the sense that yes, I mean you're right. A lot of contractors are based outside Hackney. We do have a lot of sole traders. I'm aware. I know a lot of sole traders, and I know we're also interested in exploring how to enable cooperatives. Now, up in Manchester, with People Powered Retrofit as one example, they've done some work about bringing small contractors together in a kind of cooperative arrangement to address retrofit. I don't know how big or how many properties or they've done, but I just wondered whether, as part of a Green New Deal, there can be some thinking about whether we can do a bit of work, a pilot project maybe, or something exploratory on that front. Maybe you've thought about it all already.
Yeah.
I just come in. I suppose the typography of the dwellings that we have in Hackney are going to be significantly different from somewhere like Manchester, and retrofitting homes, standalone homes, is slightly easier than when you're looking at a block.
Yeah.
There are challenges with the typography of properties we have, but I think in terms of
but we do have a lot of street properties.
Yeah.
So yeah, we do have a lot of estates, but we do have a lot of street.
Yeah,
properties.
we do. But I suppose, yeah, I mean, I'll in enabling cooperatives, that's something I'll leave to things. But one of the things about retrofit and taking that work forward, it is about the actual who gains from it. So we have so if you're investing something, you normally get a return and you pay back that investment. When we invest in retrofit, that return goes to the resident. So there are significant challenges around retrofit, and in terms of enabling cooperatives, I think I'll just hand over to Michael, because that's not something my area of expertise. But just the point about the typography and the new, Building Safety Acts and all that sort of thing, that does come into play for. I'm talking about Hackney owned properties.
Yeah. I'm thinking more about supporting businesses to provide that service to all residents.
Yeah.
So just on cooperatives, you'll all be aware of the your own party's manifesto commitments to create cooperatives, and we do some scoping work. And in economic development, we can't carry that whole agenda, and I think maybe it's a topic for another day. But what so we're actually focusing a little bit on adult social care at the moment to try and understand the opportunity there. But we will look at that Manchester example, and I'm just trying to follow up the personal connection I had a few years ago, set up a retrofit cooperative in Haringey. So I just need to connect. So we are looking at it, but we're looking at it in the context of the establishing cooperative stream. So we'll link to this where it's appropriate, but we're also looking at other sectors as well. And we probably need a separate session on establishing cooperatives.
I mean, we did discuss and look at some of that at our last meeting, didn't we? But I didn't mention it specifically then in terms of retrofit. And there obviously is some developments around the home function where they are doing just that, which enables, local tradespeople, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think just to sort of come back on it without sort of being at risk of repeating what's already been said. In terms of where we are right now, obviously we've gone out to do a feasibility study of I think it was 14 estates. 13 was it? 13. Yeah, 13 estates in the borough where we could look to sort of really for retrofit. I think if I'm quite honest, I think there's obviously the challenge of the finances that we spoke about. So the challenge that both myself and the mayor sort of set for the council is how do you sort of, we know the challenges that exist within the funding, and I'll talk about how that relates to sort of the jobs element and the delivery. But, what is we need to be ready as a council to say, look, if, for example, we can find the financing models for whichever source, whether it's the grants, what that unlocks, or whatever else is there, we need to have a plan to rapidly move forward. What is sort of that best case, middle case, and then not doing anything sort of scenarios look like? And I think there's still some work to go there. One of the things that Deirdre didn't talk about, or you may have been sort of alluding to as well, there's also challenges between sort of like leaseholders, the cost that they incur. We've already seen that through some of our early interaction, and there is a bit of pushback we get from that as well. And it's a much more complicated picture and complex picture for the reasons that Deirdre explained in terms of financing. That's thing. So we're still at that journey, that point of the journey in relation to our sort of exploration of, deliver on retrofit. I think the bit you're talking about, which is around sort of the capacity to deliver, I think we still got some sizable work to do around these areas, and then hopefully get to a point is where when we've properly sort of figured out the plan around we've got plans for pilots. But I think, what you're talking about and what we're talking about as a commission is like you're delivering this on scale, and the sort of the skills force you're going to need to deliver it. And I think that's sort of the next piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I'm not quite talking about that. I know we've got a big challenge anyway with retrofit, which is not, for this committee, but it's more about, we've talked about enabling businesses, haven't we, to kind of embrace. So what I'm talking about is probably quite small scale to start off with. And it's more about enabling and supporting local tradespeople who might well be sole traders, or they might be small businesses, to perhaps come together in some kind of optimal.
Can I make
provide a service?
Can I make a recommendation?
Yeah.
Or verbally now, and let's see whether it ends up as the final thing. Basically, Hackney Light and Power should have some kind of sole trader licensing scheme for local businesses, where they can say, yeah, we sign up to the standards of Hackney Light and Power, and we will therefore offer our services to do retrofit for owner occupiers and the private rented sector. Right? That is a way of getting young people who want to do stuff, and you could well have a partnership with the local FE colleges to be able to start training people up to do the stuff at a Hackney standard. Now, I just believe fundamentally in municipal high standards, and we should be able to do something about that. It's not straightforward, and it would require some investment, and we won't be the only ones who'll be trying it. We've got a vehicle in Hackney Light and Power, sure. And what Claire is talking about is an appetite amongst our small businesses who would want to be able to deliver it. I totally recognise the importance of doing the big estates. That's where you get volume, but we've also got probably quite a strong appetite amongst our owner occupiers, and probably quite an interest in the sole traders to be able to meet that demand if they have the skill appropriate to do that.
Sure. I mean, sorry.
Hang on.
Do you want to? And I think that will help us achieve what we want to, as well as a council, in terms of circular economy, supporting local business.
Yeah. I'm aware we've massively run over.
I'm just going to say, on that point, obviously 100% great idea, and happy to take that away, and then perhaps at the July meeting we can sort of provide an update about,
It feels more like your wider climate action plan, the Green New Deal thing, because again, it's revenue, not CapEx. Sure. But I just think if we're talking about supporting businesses, that is part of our remit here, so that's why it sort of comes.
One of the things that I was going to say actually, which about supporting local businesses, and just Councillor Turber-Doloff reminded me, is about circular economy. And Sam's been leading on this piece of work. I mean, we're not yet necessarily sort of further sort of advanced in it, but we are looking at creating our circular economy strategy for the borough. And obviously, we in our manifesto we also had a commitment around a sort of circular economy zone, and obviously how that supports and interacts with businesses. We're still at the early stages, so we're looking at, for example, using the actually, I won't comment on where the finances will come from because it's not yet confirmed, but we're looking at basically establishing the circular economy strategy for Hackney, which will hopefully then we could look at the resources of how we deploy that. But that's something that perhaps will come to sort of the commission maybe next year as well.
Well, perhaps when we do the wider climate action plan in July, because I thought what was interesting about your baseline on businesses is that the circular economy is something where we have got more businesses. Is that right? In that element?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So that might be something we'll further explore. Because I think it's interesting. That seems to be something that we're doing better at. And I think we all would be quite keen to have a definition that we understood.
Yeah.
We'll do that forward for the jobs.
Yes. Right, I'm massively over. Is there anything that anybody else wants to ask briefly on this before we go to the rest of the meeting?
I think I have a very quick question, but very quickly, because related to revenue, and it might be actually based for the July meeting about LTM fines and how that impacts the budget.
So
LTM fines and how does that impact the budget?
yeah, so the income that we receive from any penalty charge notices that the council receives, which includes low traffic neighbourhood schemes, sport streets, obviously parking charges, etc. That money goes into a parking reserves account. It's ring-fenced specifically to be only spent on transport measures, and in some cases, I believe, environmental measures done. You might want to sort of clarify on that point. So what we can't do if the money that comes through to the parking reserves account is be creative and start using it for different areas of the council. We have to reinvest it back into, for example, like, road resurfacing, or for example, infrastructure around improving transport measures, like, whether it's, like cycle lanes or like pavement slabs, those sorts of things. And what we are, and that's what we can use. So in terms of the £61 million, specifically, what we can't do is be dependent on the money we make from LTNs to be able to.
And there's fines anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we ideally we want to be in a position where we're not receiving any income from parking charges or LTN charges, because compliance is getting better. And what we have seen actually through all of the LTN, the fines that are coming through is that on where those schemes have been in place since 2020 now, compliance levels are way better, and we're receiving way less income in comparison to what you do, for example, when it's first 6 months of the scheme launching.
Great. I'm going to say thank you to everybody for your contributions. Sam, I'm sorry we didn't get more on the circular economy. I think we'll need to come back to that at another time. But your contribution specifically on 3CI was helpful in terms of the interrogation around the Green New Deal. I think we've got some clear steers on what we'd like to know more about in terms of how the long-term financial sustainability of the Green New Deal and what counts as success. Thank you again. We look forward to seeing you again in front of us in the future, specifically on the wider climate action plan. I'd just like to move on to the final bits of the meeting, which is the minutes of the previous meeting. We've got the February minutes rather than the January ones, is that right, to approve. Partly because they were helpful to inform our conversation this evening. So are we happy? There are two sets of minutes to agree, both attached on the main agenda for December and also the ones for February. Can I ask the members to agree those minutes? Agreed. Right? Yep, great, thank you. Matters arising. We've got some action updates. I've just got to read these out so that you all know what we've agreed to. There are actions on page 44 to 47 covered in the update report circulated to members of the Commission in December 2 in response to the questions raised at the SEG meeting. The report is in the agenda on pages 55 to 56. Yep. Action on page 43, members asked if the cash spent in markets was recorded. We had reported in the minutes the Economic Development Manager would follow up with the markets team about spend data for markets in the borough. The Open Scrutiny Officer is progressing this action. We will have an update shortly, i.e. not tonight. That's all on the actions from the minutes. And then we've briefly got an opportunity to discuss the work programme for coming forward. So we've got the work programme again is in the agenda outlined from 59 to 69. So it's regularly updated. The final SCG meeting of this municipal year is the 25th of April 2023 with Councillor Williams having a question time. The session will focus on the following areas: green skills and adult learning, and look at the redevelopment and changes to adult learning courses. At the second meeting in June, Councillor Williams mentioned they will be updating the adult courses, hence the desire to have a look at that. And members, we need to just check if there are any other topic areas or specific questions within the outline topic areas that we would like Councillor Williams to update on for the cabinet question time. The maximum is 3 topic areas. So if we're basically got room for one more, we're going to carry on doing what we plan to do. And there is very specifically this London research report that Councillor Premiw alerted us to on report on the circular economic work and jobs and skills for London. Councillor Williams has not been involved in this report directly, so we need to decide whether we think that it is a useful thing for us to benchmark and therefore ask questions about it in relation to the green skills and so forth. We may need to highlight that the report is obviously focused on London, and we need to consider questions that can relate to specifically. But Councillor Premier has asked about inviting the report authors to speak about circular economy and jobs. That cannot be right for the cabinet question time. It's just whether we think we want to do that now or we want to leave that to another point or another meeting.
We have that as a separate.
It feels to me that I think what Councillor Premier has done is found a really useful research thing. We could a report which would be useful to interrogate and help us in our stuff on the circular economy later. I just don't know whether it's right to bring up at the cabinet question time. What do you think, Tracy?
It's not relevant for the cabinet question.
Right. Okay, let's keep focused. So bearing in mind, we've got.
I agree with that because it is green skills and circular economy.
No, but in terms of bringing the authors in for the cabinet question time, it's not relevant. You can use the report to form your questions for cabinet question time, but not actually bring the authors in while she's doing her cabinet question.
How about as a separate item like we had today? We had 2 items today. You had that first, and then anything useful from that. Inform.
Have we got time for that? Or
you would have time, but I don't know whether we'd get the speakers now because we have got 2 weeks Easter when most people are out. So I can try, but you'd have to make sure that it's 2 separate items.
I mean, it was felt as a useful report.
Yes,
it was. But I agree in the sense of perhaps putting it as a separate, but still bringing it on. Hopefully, finding a speaker like with some similar
like Marcus
today. Yes, because it does. It is. Well, yes, it seems to have very important findings in the. I read part of it. I didn't read it full.
Well, Councillor Williams is clear that she hasn't had any direct involvement in the report. I don't think, I mean, we're not going to be cross-examining her about the report, but I think it's context within which we need to ask her questions about what's happening in Hackney. Is that right?
Well, that's what I'm thinking. I just thought it might be useful for that.
I suppose the risk is if we can't get the people, then we will want to, we put it to one side for one moment and let's think about the fact that we've already got agreed that we're going to do green skills and adult learning. So it's a third item for the cabinet question time, not for the meeting, but for the cabinet question time. So what's the third element of Councillor Williams' portfolio that we think will be useful to ask for an update? She's got employment strategy and partnerships, Hackney Works, apprenticeships, including the network and the levy, employment programmes including supported employment, adult training and paid work experience, human resources and organisational development, relationship with the trade unions, adult learning and English to speakers of other languages, delivering excellence, post-18 skills, including furthering of higher education, supporting the man living wage, equalities and anti-racism, refugees and vulnerable migrants, Windrush, policy strategy and devolution, fair trade with the climate justice and fair trade champion, and volunteering. It's not like there's plenty of things to do that we should be asking them about.
Not all of those are within our remit, are they?
Anna's raised her hand, Chair.
Sorry, Anna.
Anna's
Anna?
Oh, hi. I was just wondering, it'd be really nice for Carol, if we could ask Carol about the whole stuff we've done around sort of, our refugees and, the work we've done around the Ukrainian support package and stuff. Something like that would be quite nice.
Is that within our remit?
Yeah.
Because you've got these voluntary sector as you.
Right, okay, we could do that. What do you think?
I'm not sure if it is within our.
I mean, I was going to talk. I sort of wondered whether we did sort of employment strategies and partnerships.
Yeah.
It fits in with sort of green skills, and there's a good link there. But I mean, I'm kind of open to you.
What can you, the last time we asked about economic employment strategies and partnerships, I mean, I feel like we've done it quite recently.
But I think the update was brilliant update, especially in apprenticeships as well.
Right.
I remember that was pretty recently.
Right.
I think also because Councillor William has been heavily involved with inequalities, and I agree with Councillor Lynch on there's something about there is an intersection of the support packages for refugees, what that means for Hackney. How are we doing, and especially within the climate that we live in at the moment, and the recent announcements last night, which are very,
So in relation to those skills and the economy, I mean, I think that area is more related to the work that the scrutiny panel will do in terms of looking at
ONS, I mean.
Yeah, I don't think it's
Okay.
yeah. Unless there's any specific kind of, I don't know, volunteer, something that would involve, refugees and migrants in terms of the economy or.
You do have voluntary sector. You are voluntary secretaries in this commission. So
yes, but if it's refugees and vulnerable migrants, we'll be asking the voluntary sector. What's the question we want? I mean, going back to Anna, this is within Carol's portfolio. What aspect of the work on refugees and vulnerable migrants do we want to explore?
In context of our local voluntary provision?
Is it in the context of local voluntary provision? Is it in the context of how we're supporting refugees and vulnerable migrants into becoming economically active? I don't know.
Socioeconomic aspect.
Yeah. What were you going to say, Anna?
Yeah, I was just going to say, how does the program work in terms of resettlement and making sure that people who have skills, how we can support them back into work? So these are people that probably have been doing normal jobs, and what are we doing? What can we do as a council to support them and navigate them being able to secure employment so that they're not reliant on.
Yeah, I think that's
I just thought it'd be quite. Just politically, I think it's very good as well.
I think you're right. Politically, it is a very good idea.
It'll be a positive, as what Claudia said. We need to fill the room with the other stories of the values of people from other countries,
and also understand the barriers that
make
people to be able to contribute that aren't just about people being vile and horrible and so forth.
I mean, sorry, and it might not take long, but I think that especially in the climate now.
It will also touch on other aspects of this in terms of adult learning and ESOL, and equalities and anti-racism, just how we support. I think, let's do that. So we'll do the green skills stuff. We'll need to explore a little bit further. So let's get some questions into Tracy on what we want to know about green skills from the last time we spoke. One is, have we got any closer to a definition of green jobs? And therefore, what's our audit and understanding of the needs of green skills? What progress has been made in terms of providing that training and support?
Yeah, I mean, there are changes in course development that I'm becoming aware of at the moment, which are quite current. So what kind of, what
actually, sorry,
go on.
what you say around the sort of anti-racist strategy as well, and how that's sort of been driven across the council, and ensuring that, you know, across sectors as well, that is really kind of you know, shaping embedded in that agenda going forward. So I think yeah, that could really work.
Yeah. And then we've got a question, another area is adult learning, and look at the redevelopment and changes to adult learning courses. So I think that will be an update. So we'll probably need a brief summary of what we learned last time, so that we can, that informs our questions from last time. Because she said that they were going to be updating the adult courses, so we want to know
That follows on from her, coming to the commission in June.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm aware we've run over, which I don't like doing. Do we have any more business? No. Right. Okay. We've only run over by 7 minutes, which is quite good, bearing in mind how much we've got done today. Can I say thank you very much to everybody for your patience, bearing in mind it did run longer than we wanted it to. Did everybody get everything they wanted out of this evening?
It's been brilliant, actually. Really, really good. And I'm coming out with a couple of questions for the next session.
Good. I think the other interesting thing is sometimes we do just run out of time, but that doesn't mean we can't ask for a written answer.
Yeah.
Okay, I formally declare this meeting closed.
Thanks, Jan.
Thank you, everybody.